welcome to today's event. My name is Peter Hertwig. I am a head of unit in the European Commission's Directorate General for Research and Innovation. I have the pleasure to chair this meeting today. The subject of the meeting is cost reporting in grants under our program Horizon 2020. Why have we organized such a webinar? It is one event in a whole series of webinars where we try to inform beneficiaries of our grants on how to avoid errors, because making errors in the cost reporting is a painful thing for everybody involved, for ourselves managing these grants, but also for you, the beneficiaries, charging costs to the grants, because it might happen that you come back and the auditors knock on your door and find out that you have charged costs to the grants that were actually not eligible. And then all the painful procedures of recovery and getting the money back will start. So I should also emphasize that you should understand that this grant, once you are selected for funding, is not a prize or an entitlement. It is still based on the reimbursement of incurred costs. So the amount that you see in the grant agreement of the available money is a maximum amount that can only be paid if you provide the respective cost statements and actually incurred these costs. And this is the area where, unfortunately, there happen errors here and there from time to time. And the error rate in our program is still relatively high. And we have to try together with you, the beneficiaries, to increase the understanding on what costs are eligible and how to charge costs to our grants in order to decrease further this error rate. Today's event is special in the sense that we have invited in particular participants from so-called third countries. That means countries that are not a member of the European Union and are also not the so-called associated countries. So we welcome you very much, in particular, the ones of you living in other time zones and having the pain to join us here at times that are maybe not so convenient for you, so even more appreciated. On the technicalities of this meeting, we will have a feedback channel for you to ask questions, and we will then, after our short presentations, go in extensive question and answer session and try to reply to all your questions. Please go already now to Slido, and you will find the link to the Slido and the respective code to put in the event webpage. And I think the event webpage was just also shared in the chat in the Zoom. So if you don't have yet the link, you will find it. Just go to the chat and then go to Slido and start putting in your question at any moment. So while we speak, while the colleagues give their presentations and afterwards, and we will then at the end have time for all your questions and try to answer to them. I think that's it in terms of introduction. I would then just introduce our speakers. So there will be two presentations. The first presentation will be given by our colleague Isabelle Leroy from our legal unit. She will explain in the first instance all the rules related to personnel costs, because personnel costs are the major source of error in our grants. And then our colleague Sorin Serban will give a presentation from the point of view of an auditor, because he is an auditor from the audit unit, on what are the most common errors that they detect in their audits and how they can be avoided. So I think with this, I would now hand over to Isabelle for the first presentation on personnel costs. You will see that the presentations are focused very much on personnel costs, but in the question and answer session afterwards, you can of course ask questions on any type of costs that might occur in your grants, meaning also costs for equipment, costs for traveling, costs for consumables, and so on and so forth. And we will try to answer to your questions. Okay, over to Isabel, please.
Good morning. So I'm going to share my presentation. And this morning I'm going to, I work for the Common Legal Support Service, in which, among other things, we work on legal support for the implementation of Horizon 2020. And this morning I'm going to explain you important things to know about how to declare costs, personal costs under Horizon 2020. As Peter explained, the main objective today is to avoid errors. So what we're going to do is a brief insight into personal costs. And as most of you are perhaps newcomers or not so experienced into declaring personal costs under Horizon 2020, we're going to focus on the simplest and safest way to declare personal costs. Actually, under Horizon 2020, there are a variety of options to declare personal costs, but we're not going to explain them all today, mostly because it would be too long to explain all options, and also because some of the options are more complex and lead more easily to errors. So we're going to focus on what is the simpler options for newcomers or participants with less experience. But in any case, I will also flag all existing options so that you just know about them. So the first key message that I would like you to take with you today is that each framework program has its own rules. So you can see here the successive framework programs of the EU for research and innovation. In 2007, it was FP7 that started, and then in 2014, it was Horizon 2020, and now in 2021, it's Horizon Europe. And you can see that there's overlapping, and that's because when a new program starts, the projects of the previous program are still ongoing. So today we're going to focus on Horizon 2020, and it's still very relevant because there are many ongoing projects of Horizon 2020, and they will be ongoing for 2, 3 or 4 years. And even after that, a Horizon 2020 project can be audited, and this will go on until 2027. So if you hear that Horizon 2020 is ending, that just concerns the signature of new grants, whereas there are ongoing projects, and it's still very useful to acquire knowledge about Horizon 2020. Now, within Horizon 2020, we're going to focus on the grants which reimburse actual costs, and that's cost actually incurred. There are other types of grants under Horizon 2020 based, for instance, on lump sums or unit costs, but they are less, they imply less errors in terms of reporting because they are based on fixed amounts. So we're going to focus on the grants that reimburse actual costs, because this is where there are more errors to be avoided. And it's also because that represents the vast majority of the grants. So about personal costs, what there are basically, there are costs for time of persons who are working on a Horizon 2020 project. So there are 4 main categories for personal costs. First, there are costs for employees, which have an employment contract with the beneficiary. Then there are seconded staff. So that's staff that is provided by another legal entity than the beneficiary, but so that by a third party. Excuse me, the beneficiary can still declare costs for seconded staff under Horizon 2020. And this is typically the case, for example, of universities or other public authorities, where there are public officials who are working, for example, for the university, but which are paid by a central or local government. Then you have a third category, which is the owners of participants that are small and medium-sized enterprise. So that's the case where a beneficiary is an SME. and its owner is working on the Horizon 2020 project, and the beneficiary wants to declare costs for the work of the owner. And finally, the fourth category is other types of contract, and this will mainly concern consultants. For some of those consultants, the costs can be charged under personal costs under certain conditions. And if these conditions are not fulfilled, then consultants may not fall under personal costs, but would be maybe eligible under another cost category, which would be, for example, purchase of service. Now, more generally, about finding your way under Horizon 2020 to declare personal costs. So there's a lot of information on this slide, and this is voluntary. So it's mainly to show you the variety of the options that we offer under Horizon 2020 to declare personal costs, and that's mainly under actual costs. But what you can see also in this slide, and where we want to point you, is that there is an easy path with easier options to declare personal costs, and they are shown in light blue on the slide. So there are other options, and you may know about them, but and they're very valid, notably for more experienced participants who can grasp which options are most relevant and how to apply them correctly. But if you want to keep things simple, and that's a good strategy to avoid errors, we advise you to use the simpler options shown in light blue. And in a nutshell, this is to use an annual hourly rate based on a fixed number of annual productive hours, which is 1,720 hours. And I will explain more about this in the next slides. Also, at this point, I want to clarify that we are talking here about direct personal costs, and that's in opposition to indirect costs, because under Horizon 2020, indirect costs are covered by a flat rate of 25%, which is automatically calculated. So this is not an issue for errors, and we will explain today about direct personal costs. So now we're going to get into the calculation. So basically, you see here the formula that we apply to calculate personal costs under Horizon 2020. And so we multiply hours worked on the action by an hourly rate, which is an amount in euro per hour. So in order to know the hours worked on the action, you need time records. And in order to have an hourly rate, to come up with an hourly rate, you cannot come up with any hourly rate in any manner. You have to apply the formula that is laid out in the grant agreement. And I'm going to explain all this in further details. So the first element of the formula is the hours worked on the action. And you can only declare hours really worked on the project. So that means that you can't declare budgeted time, and mainly that's you can't declare what the hours that were indicated in your budget. That's because there are usually deviations between what you estimated for your budget and what happened in reality and how many hours were really worked on the project. And at the time of reporting and declaring costs, what we are interested in are the real hours. In the same sense, you cannot declare estimated time and you cannot declare allocated time. And here we wish to draw attention that you cannot declare a percentage of the time worked by the person. We know that in practice, in work contracts, sometimes you can see a percentage of work that the time that the person is supposed to work on a project. And that's fine from the perspective of the work contract, but you cannot use this to declare personal costs under Horizon 2020. Then to know the number of hours worked on a project, you need to record the hours in a timesheet. So you need timesheets, and the only exception is if a person works exclusively on the action, and then it can use a declaration of exclusive dedication. But otherwise, you need timesheets. And it has to be clear that the hours that you declare have to be supported by reliable time records. Otherwise, the personal costs can be ineligible. Now about the content of what information we want to see in timesheets. We have a list of minimum requirements, and you can find it in a very useful document, which is called the Annotated Model Grant Agreement. I will mention it a couple of times in the presentation. In this Annotated Model Grant Agreement, you can also find a link to an optional template of a timesheet. So that's not mandatory. You can use it, for instance, if you don't have your own time recording system. But if you have your own time recording system, you can use it as long as it fulfills the minimum requirements. Now about the second element in our formula, which is the hourly rate. So to calculate the hourly rate, you basically have to divide the personal cost recorded in your accounts by a number of productive hours. Now about these two elements, personal costs and productive hours. First, the personal costs. What can you include in the personal cost? Well, first, the salaries, also the social security contributions, that's the employer's contributions and the employees' contributions, and also tax and other costs, to the extent that the person is entitled to such elements of remuneration under their contract and under the national law. And basically, what cannot be included in personal cost are arbitrary bonuses. Now, the second element, which is the productive hours. Here, there are three options. So remember that earlier I showed you a whole tree of options. And the blue ones were the simpler ones. And here, the one that we recommend because it is simple is the first option, which is a fixed number of annual productive hours. And this fixed number is 1,720 annual productive hours. So it's a fixed number that you don't change even if the person worked less or worked more, or even if the person was on sick leave. The only case where you deduct something from this fixed number is when there is parental leave. And also this fixed number of 1,720 hours corresponds to a full-time employment. So if your employee is working part-time, you make a pro rata of this number in relation to the percentage of the time of your part-time worker. So you see that there are two other options for the productive hours, but I will, individual and standard annual productive hours, I will not get in detail into them because they are more detailed and with more conditions, and we want to stay into the simple options today. Then, now that you know how to calculate the hourly rate, the question is, how often must you calculate the hourly rate? And here there are, again, two options. So the one that we put forward bigger is the one that we recommend, and that's the annual hourly rate. So you calculate the hourly rate once per year. And here we're talking about once per your financial year and your full financial year. So you would take your annual personal cost recorded in your accounts and divide it by annual productive hours, preferably the fixed number 1,720, and do this calculation once a year for each person. Now, under annual hourly rate, you see a little warning, and this is for the situation where at the end of your reporting period, there are months for which your financial year is ongoing. So for example, if your reporting period ends on the 30th of April 2021, your financial year is ongoing, so you don't have the full figures for this year. And in this case, what you do to calculate your annual hourly rate is that you use the figures and the hourly rate of the last closed financial year. And the example I just gave, the last closed financial year would typically be 2020. The second option of the frequency to calculate the hourly rate is monthly. So that's another possibility. However, it's not as simple, mainly because you have to calculate it 12 times per year for each person. And also because there are some special features about it. For instance, if you have an element of remuneration that is generated over a longer period than 1 month, then you cannot charge it all at once in the month where you pay it, but you have to apply an entitlement per month. So that makes it a bit more complex, and we think the annual hourly rate is simpler. Now that we've seen the calculation, when you arrive at the end of the calculation, there's a double check to be made. And this check is in relation to the figures that you used to calculate the hourly rate. And this is just to ensure that you cannot declare more hours in your personal, when you worked on the action, than the annual predictive hours that you used in the formula to calculate your hourly rate. And you cannot declare more personal costs for one person for a year than the personal cost that you used in the calculation of your hourly rate. So this does not entail any loss for you. It just ensures that you're not declaring more than what you incurred. And also, if you find yourself in a situation where you realize that the result of a calculation is above one of these two ceilings, it's simple. The only thing you have to do is cap at the level of the ceiling. We really covered all the basics for the calculation of personal costs with the simple options. If you still have doubts, you can get help at the moment of reporting your costs from a web tool, which is called the Personal Cost Wizard. So it's useful, especially for newcomers and participants with less experience. You can choose your options in the wizard, and it will make the calculations and check the ceilings. And what you can see on the slide is the entry point that you can find when you are filling your financial statement at the time of reporting. Now I'm going to point out to some special cases. And the first special case is where a beneficiary would say that it wants to pay to its employees more than the normal salary to work in a prestigious grant. And of course, here we would be talking about a Horizon 2020 grant. And the answer of the European Commission would be that if you only do this for EU grants, we cannot accept it. So this is something that applies across the board. That if you, the way you report your cost is specific and you calculate costs in a specific way only for EU grants, this is not eligible in principle. However, if the beneficiary would answer that it always does so, not only for Horizon 2020 grants and all prestigious grants, then we would have to acknowledge that it's a specific case of remuneration that is called project-based remuneration. And here there are specific rules and different rules to calculate the personal costs. We will not get into them because they are actually quite detailed. And we're here just to flag this so that you know about it. And if you need more information about it, you can go to the annotated model grant agreement to understand more. I also want to reassure you that if this special case seems to you very strange, it's most likely because it's not something that you are concerned with, because this concerns a remuneration practice that varies from one country to the other. Now I'll switch to two other special cases on this slide. The first one is for the owner of a small and medium-sized enterprise when the SME is the beneficiary and the owner is working on the action. Well, firstly, if the owner receives a salary from the SME, then the SME would declare the personal cost as we explained in the first slides. But if the owner of the SME does not receive a salary, then they would not calculate an hourly rate because in any case, it would be very difficult without a salary. And the Commission for these cases has fixed an hourly rate, which the beneficiary will use to declare the personal costs. And this fixed hourly rate, we call it the SME owner unit cost. And you also have to use it if the owner of the SME is compensated by any other means than a salary, like, for example, by dividends or a service contract or any other type of contract than an employment contract. And the last special case is the case of consultants. They are not employees working on the project and you want to know how to declare them. There is a specific category of personal costs for certain consultants, and it's called personal costs for natural persons with a direct contract with a beneficiary. So one of the conditions is that there is a direct contract between the consultant and the beneficiary. There's also another main condition, which is that the consultants will work under similar conditions as an employee, and there are other conditions. So if a consultant fulfills all these conditions, the cost can be declared under this category of personal costs. And if your consultant does not fulfill these conditions, then the cost would not fall under personal costs, and they may fall under another category like purchase of services and maybe subcontract as an alternative. What we want to flag here is that you need to understand under which category your consultants fall so that you can declare the cost correctly and apply the right conditions. Now, because today most of you are from non-EU countries, we just wanted to make a little explanations on the rules to convert the costs into euros, because you have to report your costs into euros. So for beneficiaries who have accounts into euros, if they incur a cost in another currency, they will convert the cost according to their usual cost accounting practices. And the second case is if the beneficiary's accounts are in another currency than euros, so there the conversion rules are different, they have to apply a reference rate over the reporting period. So this reference rate is the average of the daily exchange rates published in the EU official journal. And we're not expecting you to consult the official journal every day so that you can make your average. There is, in fact, a web tool on the European Central Bank website where you can choose your currency and insert the starting date of the reporting period, the end date of the reporting period, and then it gives you the average conversion rate that you have to use for all the costs reported in this period. So that's the end now of my explanations. I just want to point you to where you can find further information. So for more information generally on all the options that we have mentioned today, even the ones that are more complex and on which you would maybe want to find more information, there is the annotated model grant agreement. If you want information on more practical aspects of grant management, that's the online manual, and you find both documents on the Funding and Tender Opportunities portal. If you have further questions that you would like to raise after reading, for example, more details on these documents, you can contact, for instance, your national contact points if your country has appointed national contact points, but we have a long list of countries which have national contact points. So they are knowledgeable about Horizon 2020, but they also know your national legislation, your specificities in your country, and they speak your language. And another possibility to send questions is the Research Inquiry Service, which is a help desk of the Commission. And there you would be sending the question to our services and to the people who have drafted their documents and the grant agreements and guidance documents. And that's the end of my presentation for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Very clear and to the point. Before I hand over to our second speaker, again, a word on using the Slido. So I said you should not hesitate to put in your questions at any moment, and please do this. You can also vote on the questions of others. So if you see that your question is already there, don't key it in a second time, but vote on the existing question. And we will at the end go through all the questions in the order of number of votes from top to bottom. That was my request to you on the using the Slido. And now I think I will hand over to our second speaker, Sorin Serban, who will tell us the story from the point of view of somebody who might knock on your door and check all the details of your costs, meaning an auditor. Sorin, please.
Thank you very much, Peter. So I will try to put the presentation. However, I'm not sure I have the right button.
Emmanuel, can you check?
I'm checking, yes.
Yeah, I don't see the button to present, sorry.
But you are a co-host, so you should be able to present. Do you have, next to the chat button at the bottom, do you have the share screen?
Yes, that's okay.
That's the
Now
one.
I have, okay. I can share, sorry, so up. Okay. Oh, can you see the presentation?
Yes,
we
very
can.
good. All looks good.
Sorry for that. Okay, so good morning. My name is Soren Serban. I work in the Common Audit Service in DG Research and Innovation, which is the unit in charge of performing the audits, ex-post audits for Horizon 2020 grants. And with the risk of trying to avoid repeating the rules already explained by our colleagues in the legal unit, we'll go through from an auditor's point of view of how you can avoid errors. So first of all, to present, for example, from our point of view, why errors they occur. So obviously there's a misunderstanding of the rules, and this seminar should help better understanding the rules. And I hope this would be useful. And also with the questions, of course, afterwards. This can be due also to the lack of attention to the detail of the provisions of the grant agreements. And as well, sometimes, of course, intentionality could also arrive to errors. And the consequences of errors are due mostly from point of view of beneficiaries. The consequences are that for beneficiaries, there will be a non-optimal use of the funding available for the grant, and eventually some recoveries as well of cost unduly paid. For the European Commission, there will be a scrutiny, of course, of the budgetary authority and the European Court of Auditors. This can arrive at an increased error rate. The errors that you may do increases obviously the overall error rates, and which will also in turn increase the ex-post audit efforts, and which will also arrive at corrective measures from our side. So having said that, what we do in the audit, so we try to test, to extract a sample from the population of auditable financial statements, which you submit for the grants, and we calculate the percentage of error rate by dividing the sum of the negative adjustments to the sum of the audited amount. So this is more or less what when we talk about the error rates for the Horizon 2020 based on ex-post audits. The purpose of this is to give assurance to the responsible authorizing officers, which are the units in charge of implementing these grants, by assessing the legality and regularity of Horizon 2020 project payments, and by assessing as well indirectly the residual error rate and to maintain it to attain an acceptable level. Obviously, the residual error rate is basically the remaining error rate, which is calculated based on statistically based on the results of the audit findings. The general control objective is to get the residual error rate as close as possible to 2% without necessarily expecting it to get under 2%. So obviously, we hope that this seminar will also help into that respect. Main detected errors from audits for the personnel cost are due to incorrect productive hours calculation, obviously due to the 3 options. So a strong advice and kind advice to use the most easier option if possible. Obviously also incorrect remuneration cost, estimated cost, for example, or budgeted cost, obviously not actual cost which are incurred, are declared by beneficiaries. So this is a source of error as well. Incorrect time working, on action claimed. So obviously this comes or should come from timesheets. And if this is not the case, then there are adjustments and corrections by the auditors, by the audits, and other unreliable or missing timesheets. That's obviously a major source of error as well. And this can yeah, this has an effect to consider the personal cost, potentially consider the personal cost as ineligible. So yeah, we raise your attention to these main detected errors in personal cost. Now, to make sure that your personal cost is correct, with the risk of maybe repeating what the colleagues already mentioned, your personal cost will be calculated as being a number of hours worked. This number of hours worked should reconcile with the timesheets you have for the project. So the number of hours worked here should be normally the same as the timesheets for the project, for each person involved in the project. And this should be multiplied by a so-called hourly rate that we call hourly rate, which is obviously there are several possibilities to calculate the hourly rate, but the easier one would be to have an actual individual hourly rate. So to divide the actual personal cost of the person working for the project to the productive hours, so preferably 1,720 hours. The personal cost explained above, total personal cost that we expect in the audit is to have the basic salary plus the social security contribution plus the eventual add-ons which are eligible. So please read carefully which add-ons could be considered eligible. And to obviously divide this by the total productive hours, options 1, 2, and 3, preferably option 1. So that's basically how you can double check yourself as well at the end when reporting the cost in your financial statement to see whether the personal costs are correctly calculated. Now, to make sure that your time, now other checks, of course, before submitting your financial statements would be to ensure, so this is maybe more linked to the left side of the calculation that I just showed, which is linked to the number of hours claimed for the project, to ensure that your time recording is consistent with the human resources records. So the time recording is obviously either an electronic one or based on timesheets only, but you should ensure, for example, that holidays taken by the person, which are booked in the human resources records, coincide, of course, and are the same with the time records of the person. To properly date and sign the timesheets, that's also some of the 6 minimum criteria that you have to fulfill for the time recording system that you find in the rules. And yeah, not to declare cost in excess of your full-time employment. This seems obvious, but when calculating the hourly rate, maybe it's not so obvious. So that's why we have this so-called double ceiling rules, which means that you shouldn't claim more hours than you worked on the project, and you shouldn't claim also on the EU projects, and you shouldn't claim also more personal cost than you have incurred in your accounts. So the personal cost should be actual. And yeah, the time recording system should be sufficient in terms of information. So once again, this refers to the 6 minimum criteria, 2 of which are explained above, the date and the signature. One of which is explained above. This is one condition, sorry. So another view, let's say, is to look at the numerator. So we looked on the previous slides on the left side, the number of hours. Now we look at the upper side of the calculation of the hourly rate. So this personal cost, to check the personal cost, the eligible personal cost should include, as I was mentioning in the formula, the salaries, the basic salaries, the social security contributions, the employers and employees. So here the employee social security contributions are usually included in the brute salary. So please don't add it a second time, but it is mentioned for clarity, and the taxes and other costs included in the remuneration if they arise from the national law or the employment contract, and this has to do with these add-ons. So please carefully read the rules on adding additional elements to the personal cost. Do not include, obviously, any ineligible item, which are clearly mentioned in Article 6.5 of the financial provisions of Horizon 2020 Multi-Grant Agreement, or any cost included in the other budget categories. like indirect cost. Obviously, indirect costs are calculated as 25% of the direct cost minus subcontracting, as already mentioned by my colleagues. For the denominator, so for the down part of the calculation of the hourly rate, the advice is obviously to use 1,720 hours, especially if the employment contract does not specify the working time conditions or if the annual workable hours cannot be determined. Obviously, this shouldn't be confused with other type of personnel which are not employees. So this is really applicable only for employees. Then for other categories, you should carefully read the other provisions. As I was mentioned, for example, for the SME owners, or as it has been mentioned earlier. The other two options are, I don't want to repeat, but individual and productive hours. And the formula is to calculate it using the overtime and the absences, or the standard annual productive hours, in which there's a minimum threshold to comply with, which is 90%. This number of standard annual productive hours should be at least 90% of the standard annual workable hours. The difference between workable and productive is the, let's say, the non-productive time, which is calculated as being the absences and holidays, which is well explained in the annotated grant agreements that you saw already as reference in the previous presentation. In order to avoid errors, please make sure that your time charged to the project is correct. So this is repetition once again. It refers to the left side of the calculation of the personnel cost. So obviously the time is the one which is in the timesheets and is clearly reliable and in line with other relevant data on the number of hours worked for the project, the time record, and for example, the travel for the project and so on. And the time records meet the general agreement's conditions. So that's maybe very general, but once again, to double check each time you have doubts. The remuneration in the numerator is correct. So what we just saw with the basic salary, social security contributions, and the add-ons, and the productive hours in the denominator are correct. Also, the personal cost formula reconciles, so basically arithmetical checks, in fact, to see that there is no other type of errors in your calculations in the personal cost. And the transaction listing reconciled as well for personal cost, but obviously this is valid as well for other type of costs, like for example, for the travel cost and so on. The ones that you have in the reporting should be exactly the same as the ones you have in your project accounting incurred in your cost. Yeah. And then the employment contracts are in place, obviously, and they are in line with the calculations. Said differently, the calculations are in line with employment contracts, obviously. And also, as mentioned also by my colleagues previously, most probably will also have to pay attention to the exchange rate provisions if you do not have your accounting in euro. So to use the exchange rate, which is stipulated by the Horizon 2020 legal provisions, as mentioned by my colleagues. So of course, all these tests should be performed before you press the button to send this in the system. Well, thank you for your attention and participation. And I think what I could mention also, which is not yet in the presentation, is that if you have further doubts, you can also have a look in the Horizon 2020 indicative audit program, where you have, in fact, the main checks that are indicative checks that are done by the auditors during ex-post audits, and you can use these checks probably to auto-evaluate your financial statement if you have doubts, or you specifically check specific elements, how to double-check them from an auditor's perspective. Thank you very much. Peter?
Thank you very much, Sorin. We would now enter the question and answer session. I would encourage you again to go to Slido, and you still have the link to our event website in the chat on the right side of the Zoom, and put in your questions and vote on the questions of others. And as I said at the beginning, the questions can extend also to other cost items, not just to the personnel costs. Any questions you have on cost reporting and the eligibility of costs in Horizon 2020 grants, any of these questions you can ask, and we will try to answer them. Before we start going through the questions, we have one little poll also in the Slido. This is just for us to understand who is out there listening to us and participating here. So Olivier, if you can start this Slido poll, and dear participants, please go to Slido. And yes, I think you start already entering. Okay. We will wait for a moment. We should also say that some of you follow us via a YouTube stream, and there is a few seconds of latency. So let's wait a bit more for the participants being able to put in their replies. Okay, so we have currently 33 replies. We see that we have in the order of 120 participants. So let's wait another moment to give you the chance to reply. Okay, I think we can stop this now. The figures are consolidated. So, okay, thank you very much. We see that still 1/3 of you are actually established in the EU, but there is quite a number of people also from the actual target addressees of today's meeting. So very good, thank you very much. I would then switch over to your questions, and we will go through them, as I said, in the order of likes. But still, I encourage you, while we reply to the first questions, also to put in more questions, not only on personnel costs, but also on any other cost item that you might have questions on. Okay, let's start. First question. What are the minimum details that need to be shown in the timesheet? Isabel, do you want to give it a start?
Yes,
and then
sure.
Maybe David can also come in.
So the minimum requirements, as I said, they are explained in the annotated model grant agreement under the Article 18 on the keeping records. And they are namely that the timesheet should include the title and number of the action, the beneficiary's full name, the full name, date, and signature of the person working for the action, the number of hours worked for the action in the period covered by the timesheet, and the supervisor's full name and signature, and a reference to the action task or work package. And the timesheet must be signed at least monthly by the person working and by the supervisor. So these are the minimum details. If you, that's also perhaps taking up the next question, but if you don't have a time recording system, what you can do is use the template which we provide in the annotated model grant agreement. It's not mandatory, but it's this template, if you use it, ensures that you are complying with the minimum requirements. And if you're using your own timesheets, you should just ensure that they include the minimum details.
Hi, this is David. Olivier, could you give me access to share my screen, because I can show the template with the minimum requirements?
This is me who needs to do it, but you have access.
Sorry.
You are a co-host. It's the portal team who needs to do it.
Okay.
But you are a co-host, David, so you should see that button.
All right. Yes, I got it now. Thank you very
Okay.
much. Let's try share. So you should be looking now at one
Yes, we can
document,
see it, yeah.
which is indeed, it is the template for those of you who do not have as a usual practice to have time records. So we have produced this template where you can see really what we are requesting there is absolutely minimal. What is Isabel explained, the title of the action, the beneficiary names, and the name of the person, the number of hours per month, and the work packages in which the person worked during that period. So this is the really minimal thing. And if there is a simple measures in our rules is, I would say, no timesheets, no money. So really remember that in Horizon 2020, this is not an option. You must have timesheets, either because it's your usual practice and you already have something that complies with these minimum requirements that Isabel explained, or you can use these templates for the people that works in the Horizon 2020 action and for the time that the person works in the Horizon 2020 action. We don't care for the rest of the activities of the person. So I just wanted to show you that we have this document. By the way, the link to this document is in the Horizon 2020 annotated model grant agreement that Isabel talked about it during her presentation, and the link to this annotated model grant agreement is also in the slides. Thank you very much. Stop sharing.
Yes, the link is in the slides, and we should also mention that it will be on the event website that we shared in the chat here, or maybe it is already on the event website. So you will find, in any case, all the documents and all the links to documents we are talking about here later on in the event website. Okay, let's go to the next question. Are in-house consultants eligible under which conditions? Isabel again, please.
So in-house consultants, they can fall under the category of personal costs, and a specific category which is called personal costs for natural persons with a direct contract with a beneficiary. But there are certain conditions to fall under that category. And that's mainly, first, there must be a direct contract between the consultant and the beneficiary. So if the contract is with another company, not directly with the consultant, it cannot fall under this category. And there are other conditions, such as, notably that the consultant must work under similar conditions as the conditions for an employee. That's in terms of organization of the work, of supervision of the work, and time presence, for instance. The result the work must belong in principle to the beneficiary, and that's the main principle. And also the remuneration must be in terms of working time rather than based on output. And these conditions, are detailed under the annotated model grant agreement under the Article 6.2a.2. And if the consultant does not fulfill the minimum conditions, I just forgot another one that I'm going to say, is that the remuneration must be similar to the remuneration of a similar employee, which has a similar tasks. If your consultant does not fulfill all these conditions, then it will not fall into the specific category of personal costs. It does not mean that you cannot charge any cost for your consultant. It just means that it may fall under another category of costs, and that may be the category of purchase of service, or possibly subcontract if the consultant is actually performing action tasks described in Annex 1 of your grant agreement. And the main conditions for these two categories, purchase of service or subcontract, is that you must ensure when you award the contract that there is best value for money for the contract, and there is no conflict of interest.
Okay, thank you very much. And next question. If a researcher during a reporting period passes from junior researcher contract to senior researcher one through a public selection, can we have two separate hourly rates? Isabel.
So if you are using an annual hourly rate, so you're going to calculate for the full financial year, and the element of your calculation, which is personal cost, the personal cost recorded in your accounts, you're going to put everything together. And then you would divide by annual predictive hours, for example, by 1,720 hours. So that would be the way to do it. If you are doing a monthly calculation of your hourly rate, then when there is a change in remuneration from one month to the other, because the researcher has changed category, then you would change in the month where it was a junior researcher, the personal cost for that month would be the personal cost corresponding to junior. And then when it switched to a senior researcher, then the personal cost for this month would be at the level of the senior researcher remuneration.
Okay, that sounds clear. Next question: for a person working exclusively for the action with standard annual productive hours, how do we do the calculation of worked hours when there are sick leaves?
So that's, first of all, I would have to say that when the fact of working exclusively for the action only has for us relevance in terms of how you record the time that you worked on the action, because it gives you the possibility, instead of timesheets, to use this declaration of exclusive dedication. However, this does not change the way that you calculate personal costs and report personal costs. And in this question, I see that there is the question of sick leave. What happens, in fact, when you're using the declaration of exclusive dedication is that if a person is out of office, for example, on leave or sick leave, more than half of a month, this month cannot be counted as worked on the action under this declaration. So that's the thing for that you will have for the reporting of the hours of the time worked on the action. And so this month, if that's more than half, will be out. You won't be able to report hours for this month.
Okay, thank you. I think the next question we already replied, but we can maybe emphasize it again. What if the company doesn't have timekeeping records? In this case, if this is not your standard practice to have time records, if you participate in a grant in Horizon 2020 and you want to charge personnel costs to this grant, you must have time recording. And if you don't have a standard way of doing it, you use the template that we just explained. Otherwise, if the auditor comes to you and you have no time records for the person to charge to the project, none of these costs will be eligible, and all of these costs will have to be recovered. So this is really serious. And this is also one of, unfortunately, the major sources of errors on the personnel costs that we observe. So please keep in mind that you need to have time records, even if this is not your standard practice, if you participate in Horizon 2020. Okay, next question. Now we come to Marie Skłodowska-Curie actions. If there is some research training and networking money left, can we use it to pay higher salaries to ESRs in the last months of the project? I am afraid there are no real experts on Marie Skłodowska-Curie here in the room, but maybe Isabel or David, could you try to give it a go? Yeah.
Isabel, if you want, perhaps while we were speaking, I was looking for this in the annotated model grant agreement. Just also to show that really everything is there. And I'm gonna try to share with you the specific explanation in the annotated model grant agreement. You see, this is page 461. So yes, the annotated model grant agreement is a very long document. And there are specifically for the ITN actions, Marie Skłodowska-Curie, you see that there is an explanation saying that unit costs for management and indirect costs should be used for the management of the action, but unused amounts may also be used for other action-related purposes, as for instance, to increase the salary of the researcher. So without being an expert, we can also go into the annotated model grant agreement and find our reply. So there is a specific unique cost, which is the one dedicated to management and indirect costs, for which if you have remaining amounts, you may use it indeed to other action related purposes, like increasing the salary of the researcher. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you very much, David. So let's go back to the questions. Next one. If a staff member has 2 different contracts assigned based on a selection process in the same year, how should her cost and productive time be calculated? I assume it's a similar question to the one we had already. So the issue here, do we mean 2 different contracts in sequence or at the same time? So maybe we should reply to both options.
Yeah, so if they are in sequence, it's the same situation indeed as I explained previously, which is that if you have an annual hourly rate, you will just put into the personal cost recorded in your accounts all the personal costs for the first and then the second contract. And then you would divide by the annual productive hours, and they would preferably the fixed amount, the fixed annual productive hours of 1,720 hours. And if it's a monthly rate, then you would have to adapt from when the change comes from one month and then for the next month. However, if the 2 contracts are at the same time, maybe, but there's perhaps not enough information in the question to be sure, but maybe it's a case where a person receives a different remuneration under one of the contract for specific work. And there we would maybe be in this case that I just had, there was just one slide about it, which is called project-based remuneration. That's cases where people get remuneration specifically for specific work. For example, on a specific project, they get additional remuneration, let's say. And then we get into a very particular way of calculating the personal costs, where there is mainly the rules apply mainly for additional remuneration for non-profit legal entities. And you have to see basically if the additional remuneration goes above what is paid for normal remuneration for national projects, and additional remuneration that is detected because it goes above this level of what is paid for national projects would be added on top of what you calculated as personal cost in a limit of 8,000 euros per year. So this is quite a complex case. If it is a case of project-based remuneration, and it would need to have further details looked into, notably in the annotated model grant agreement again.
Okay, so I think the next question we have already replied. If a researcher has an internal career development and change of contract without selection, should we calculate the average to have 1 hourly rate for the reporting period? So just to remind what the reply was, in the preferred option, in our option, meaning that you go for annual hourly rates, this would in fact be the average for the whole year. So you take the total salary costs of that person for the whole year, which includes a part with a lower salary and another part with a higher salary, but doesn't matter. And you divide by the number of hours worked by the person in the whole year. So that is all by the standard productive hours. So that is absolutely clear. If you use the monthly, Isabel has explained that, then of course the hourly rate of the given month applies, and if the salary changes, the hourly rate will also change. Okay. Next question. For a person hired exclusively for the action with standard annual productive hours, do we need to have time records? Isabel.
So the situation where you have a person working exclusively on the action is the only case where instead of timesheets, you can use a declaration of exclusive dedication. However, there are specific conditions to be able to use this declaration. So we always have to be careful when you use it. And that's notably because you can only use one declaration per reporting period. And this you can only use it if the period during which there is full dedication on the Horizon 2020 action is more than one full calendar month. And the period during which you have this dedication must also be uninterrupted. So the issue here is that if you are sure that the person is going to work for a long period of time, fully dedicated to the Horizon 2020 action, you can use this declaration of exclusive dedication, for which there is a template available from a link in the annotated model grant agreement. However, if you have a person that's going to work at some moments with fully dedication to the action and in other times working on other projects, you could easily fall into a situation where the declaration cannot be used because it's interrupted periods and maybe not the full covering a full month. And then you have to ensure that you do have timesheets, because if you have been relying on the declaration and you realize at the end that it's not possible to use it, it will be difficult then to go back to timesheets. So it's only if you're sure that the person will work for a long period of time, fully dedicated to the action without interruption.
Okay, thank you. Next question. What is the process for going back to a previous financial report to correct an error that was reported, meaning remove a cost that was claimed that is not eligible?
So that's called an adjustment, and you use it when you make an error in the reporting, and you simply when you are reporting in the next reporting period, you make an adjustment to what you've reported in the previous reporting period. So it's quite straightforward process.
Yes, okay. Next one, in an institution using the 1720 option, a person working exclusively for the action worked 1900 hours in a year, 1700 hours excluding holidays. Is the limit to charge the action 1720?
So if you're using as annual productive hours the option of the fixed amount 1720 hours, it's fixed. So it's not even a limit, it's just this number. Whatever the person worked, more or less, and even if the person was on sick leave, you keep this number. And as already mentioned, but it's the only case where you deduct something. If a person was on parental leave, then you deduct the hours that were on parental leave from the number.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I add something maybe here?
Of course, please.
Thank you, Peter. So I think we should clearly distinguish between the productive hours, the option which is 1720, which is used to calculate the hourly rate, meaning in the denominator of the calculation, and the number of hours worked on the action, which is on the left side of the formula that we just showed on the slides, which is linked to the number of hours worked for the action. So there are two separate notions here, just to be sure we have the same understanding. Thank you.
And I may also add that the question may be related to double ceiling. So if the person, the institution using in the calculation of the hourly rate, the fixed number 1720, when it's going to report the number of hours worked in the action, this number cannot go beyond 1720 because that's part of the double ceiling check.
Okay, thanks. The next question is the first one actually on cost items other than personnel costs. Thanks for this question. During audit, are supporting documents needed for the indirect costs applied in the grant, or the calculation using the 25% rate will suffice?
I can take this one,
yeah,
Peter. So obviously the indirect costs are calculated based on 25% flat rate applied on the direct cost without subcontracting cost. So there is no expectation from the rules. So this is a simplification compared to FP7. There is no expectation in terms of compliance from the auditor and from the rules that you keep still cost to demonstrate how you calculated 25%. It's just you calculate 25% and that will suffice. So no need of supporting documents for the indirect cost. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next question, should timesheets be integrated with all projects the employee is working in, or is it better to have a timesheet for each project? Isabel.
I don't know if Sorin has a further
Or
idea.
Sorin, yes.
At the moment of auditing, would they?
Yes, so I can take this one. So it's true that the best practice would be to integrate timesheets. Like that, you can ensure already and prevent the double ceiling limits already at the level of the timesheets. So if you have one person working for multiple actions, it's obviously easier to trace his time, overall time of the person through all the action. Like that, you can ensure as well that there is no double claiming of the same hours on different actions. So the best practice would be, yes, indeed, to have them integrated with all the projects of the employee. Thank you.
I might just add that, of course, for our purpose, there is no obligation to show us evidence or to put in your timesheet hours that the employee has worked on other things. So what we expect as a minimum in the timesheet for Horizon 2020 grants is that the hours charged to the Horizon 2020 grant are encoded there. Okay, next question. Do we have to respect the budgeted time for personnel costs in the initial proposal, or can we adapt it to our estimates of working hours for all activities? Also an important question.
So when you make an estimation at the beginning of the project of the budgeted times for personnel cost, it's only an estimation. And of course, there can be some deviations. At the time of the reporting, you will explain in your report if there are deviations on the use of resources, and that will be seen maybe at the project officer that it's fine that there are some slight differences. However, in terms, if we are talking about now reporting, when you are reporting, you really have to report the real hours worked.
Yeah. Okay, and maybe we can add that indeed between the budgeted time in a proposal and the time actually charged to the project, there can of course be a difference, and there is flexibility in adapting to the actual needs of the project as they occur. Next question, if we cannot indicate sick leave as hours worked, who will pay for it? Are they still included in the grant as indirect costs?
So sick leave, the way it will be taken into consideration depends on the option that you use for the annual productive hours, but in a way they're always taken into consideration. So if you have the, as the option for annual productive hours, if you have the fixed number 1720, it takes this into consideration because it's a fixed number, which has been calculated to take this into consideration in some way. If you are using individual annual productive hours, you will deduct the actual sick leave of the person, of the individual person. And if you are using standard annual productive hours, which are based on the standard practices of an entity for its in its accounting practices for annual productive hours, this standard usually takes into consideration a standard number of sick leave days. So they are taken into consideration in the calculation.
Okay. Next one, if an employee starts working this year and there isn't any hourly cost rate referred to the year before, what hourly cost rate do I have to use in the financial reporting?
So indeed, when you don't have figures of the last closed financial year for a person because it was employed during the ongoing financial year, you will have to use the figures of the ongoing year. This is the only case where you don't apply the last close financial year for annual hourly rate. And so use the personal cost recorded in your accounts for the ongoing year and pro rata of the annual productive hours corresponding to the moment from the beginning of the year until the end of the reporting period.
Okay, next one. If a company, given the COVID issue, is currently paying to the SME owner an amount which is lower than the value indicated in the contract, will this be a problem? I think we should reply to this on the two assumptions that one, this person gets a salary, or that this person uses the SME owner manager unit costs. Isabel.
Yes, so if the person is receiving a salary, we will have to take into consideration the amounts which are actually paid because it's actual costs. And then the calculation, when you calculate the hourly rate, will be based on the personal cost recorded in your account, so what was actually paid. However, in the different situation where the owner of the SME is not receiving a salary, or if it's receiving any other type of compensation than a salary like dividends or a service contract or anything else than a salary via an employment contract, then what applies is what we call the SME owner unit cost, for which the Commission has fixed an hourly rate. And then this amount is fixed in the Commission decision. It will appear in your grant agreement, and that does not change whatever is paid in practice. So you can report on the basis of this SME owner unit costs, irrespective of what is paid.
Okay. Next one, our monthly salary per person was given very high for the region. I can't pay them less, but give more hours. I don't know whether you understand what is meant here.
I wonder if this also for Maria Zlodowska-Curie, whether there is a fixed amount on the allowances. If that is the case, if it concerns a Maria Zlodowska-Curie action, the amount of the allowance for the researcher must be paid to the person. Mm-hmm. We know that occasionally, and in some countries, and this is less in Horizon 2020, but it happened relatively often in FP7, is quite an important amount for the level of the researcher. But it is like that. This is in the grant agreement. When you sign the grant agreement, you commit to the comply with obligations, among which that the allowance that is for the researcher must be paid and used completely for the researcher. And no, you are not supposed to make the people work more than the others because the salary is high compared with the others. It's, so to say, one of the benefits in this case of the Maria Zlodowska-Curie action. I can only make sense of the question in that context. I don't know if, Isabel, you have other ideas in a different context.
No, I don't.
Okay. So let's go to the next one. What about hours worked for national regional projects for the calculation of the hourly rate?
So I think we are only talking here about time worked on a Horizon 2020 project. And so I don't really see the relevance of the question for this, because hours worked for other projects than the Horizon 2020 project cannot be reported, and you cannot claim costs for hours worked on another project than Horizon 2020. So it will not be taken into consideration in our formula when you multiply the number of hours by an hourly rate.
Yes, but I mean, maybe to add to this, of course, indirectly, all these costs go into the calculation of the hourly rate.
In the calculation of the hourly rate,
yes.
You will take the full personal costs for the recorded in your accounts for the total year and divide by annual productive hours, which are the total annual productive hours
yes.
for a year.
That's exactly it. Okay. Next one, can we observe payment based on local labor laws? For example, can one be paid on a public holiday?
Well, that's related to when you're calculating your hourly rate, when you have the element of the formula, which is the personal cost recorded in your accounts and what you can put in there. You have the salary, the social contributions, and other elements. And if under your national legislation, it's part of the remuneration to have some payment covering some type of holiday, then it's part of the total cost that will be taken into consideration in the hourly rate.
Exactly. So this goes indirectly into the hourly rate, but of course you cannot charge virtual hours of work on these days, because you can, so your timesheet should not contain any hours that are not worked on a public holiday, so to say.
Yes, and you can only declare costs which comply with the national labor law, so they have to comply with that too.
Okay, next one. Could you please tell us how much is the SME owner hourly rate? Do we have to use it in the estimation of the budget in the proposal? I hope David will again be very quick in finding the exact amount, which is in the work program, I think.
I didn't go on that now, but if I am right, it's around 30 euros per hour, but it is adjusted by the country correction coefficient, which can be as low as 62% of this amount up to 130 something percent. So the best is indeed to check in the work program for the exact figures, because the 34 euros as a reference doesn't make a big, it doesn't give much details because of the high impact of the country correction coefficient.
Okay, so I think we will also add the hyperlink to this place in the work program where the hourly rates are established, so that you can find it afterwards. But there is a second part of the question: do we have to use it in the estimation of the budget in the proposal? And I think the reply is yes. Yes, if you plan to have an SME owner manager who doesn't receive a salary working in this project, you use exactly this estimation to establish the budget for your proposal. Okay, another question on the 1720 hours. To come back to the question of the 720 hours versus an employee working a minimum of 1900, can you use 1900 as the fixed number of hours instead of 1720? I think the plain reply is no, but Isabel, you can again explain even more.
So if you are using the option of the fixed number, which is 1,720, you cannot change this number. So you cannot use instead 1,900. Maybe in your case, if you have a standard practice of using 1,900, and this is usual practice to use standard productive hours, maybe you could explore this possibility, but you have to make sure that you have an amount of annual workable hours which is identifiable either in your contract or collective labor agreements or national law, and that this amount, this number 1,900 represents at least 90% of the workable annual hours. And then maybe this would be more what you're looking for.
If I might complement, because in the original question, the inquirer said that it was 1900 but 1700 without holidays. Holidays is not working time. So even if you would use that situation, you would not charge to us 1900 hours, because if the person was supposed to be in holidays 200 hours, those are hours not eligible. You cannot charge them. So to be frank, probably it's more interesting financially for you to keep on the 1720, and you will charge until up to 1720 if this, particularly if the person worked exclusively in the action during the whole year. You may use the declaration and charge the 1720, and you are already charging the full salary of the person to the action because the person worked during the whole year exclusively on it. I think that might be a misunderstanding there on the calculations, just to complement the information.
Okay. Next question: if a beneficiary is putting in more hours than others, can we swap allocated time within the consortium members? How do we do this? Maybe we can reply to this question in a more general sense on what is the flexibility in a consortium to change the allocation of tasks, time, costs, and so on?
Yes, so this is related to what we call budget transfers. So when you made your proposal, you made a budget estimation, and this estimation of the budget is provided in Annex 2 of your grant agreement. Then during the course of your project, you may see that you would need to transfer some of the budget from one category to another, or from one beneficiary to another. And here, when we're talking specifically about costs for personnel, you can do these transfers at the time of reporting. So you report the reality of the cost, and you don't need to make an amendment to make these transfers. Basically, the limit of the flexibility of these transfers is when the transfer that you're making is not a transfer only of budget, but it's transferring an action task described in Annex 1 of the grant agreement, or any transfer that implies a significant change in the Annex 1 of your grant agreement. Then you have to request an amendment to make this transfer. But when we're talking of transferring budget from personal cost from one beneficiary to another, usually this is not, if it's not concerning and it's not covering an action task, then it's a simple transfer with no amendment, and you do it at the time of reporting.
Okay, next one, some employees are getting an additional salary at the end of the year as a 13th month. Could be included in the calculation of personnel costs?
So yes, absolutely. So when you are using an annual hourly rate, you include your 13th month in the amount of personal costs recorded in your accounts that you will then divide by annual productive hours. And if you are using monthly hourly rates, as the entitlement to the 13th month is generated over a longer period than 1 month, you don't just charge the 13th month in the month when you pay it. For example, you don't charge it only in December. You have to allocate an entitlement pro rata in each month, for which you calculate the monthly hourly rate.
Okay, next question. If the hours worked are higher than the maximum set limit, must we always stick to the limit?
So I think this is related to the double ceiling, indeed. So you have to, the limit in the double ceiling for the hours are the productive hours that you use to calculate the hourly rate. So for example, if you are using to calculate the hourly rate, the fixed number, 1,720 annual productive hours, this is the limit of the hours that you can declare for the action. So you cannot declare more hours worked on the action than 1,720 hours.
Okay. Now again, a question on other cost items. If the equipment purchased to carry out the planned activities remains available to the end users, are only the depreciation costs eligible?
Well, by default, you can only charge, by default, what you charge for equipment costs are the depreciation costs. So you have to calculate them, the value over the useful value of the equipment, and charge only the portion over the duration of the action. And what remains available after the action is not eligible. So, yeah.
Okay. Is the doubled ceiling checked for a person for a year, not for a reporting period?
It's indeed calculated per year, not per reporting period. So you have to ensure that what you declare for one person for a year under EU grants does not go above the ceiling of the personal cost that you use to calculate the hourly rate and the annual productive hours that you use to calculate the hourly rate.
Okay, per year.
Per year.
Yeah. Next one, with standard productive hours and sick leave, do we have to keep the denominator in the formula but deduce the hours of sick leave in the dedicated hours?
So when you are using for the annual productive hours the option of standard productive hours, usually in your standard accounting practice you deduct sick leave. So that's the number, you will deduct this from the number of productive hours that you will use to calculate the hourly rate. And then I understand that when you have the hourly rate, you want to multiply it by the hours worked on the action. And for the hours worked on the action, you will also deduct the hours on sick leave, because you can only declare as hours worked on the action the hours actually really worked on the action. So that's not when the person is on sick leave. So actually you deduct them from both.
That's this, David. Sorry, that's why we insist so much on the time record. Say what we can contribute is to the reality of the hours that the person worked for the action. So if the person was on sick leave, he's not working on the action. Well, hopefully it's not working on the action. And if she or he is working on the action, that's probably not legally in accordance with your national labor law, because if it is in sick leave, it's in sick leave. It's to be able to recover from the sickness. So we insist. Time records are for what to record and declare the number of hours worked in the action. There is no automatization. Even if you hired a person with intention that the person would work just in the action, that's not enough. You need to report always the reality. That's why the time records, and only the time records, the number of hours that the person really worked on the action.
Okay, next question. Is a not-for-profit foundation similar to an SME? Where can I find the SME owner unit costs as defined by the Commission?
So if we are talking of the possibility to use the SME owner unit cost for the hourly rate of the owner, this is only for SMEs, and it's also for natural persons who are themselves a beneficiary in an action. So it's not for a non-profit foundation. And if you still want further details on the SME owner unit cost, it's defined. So in the Commission decision, there I can give the number. So it's the C 2013-8197, and there is a link to this decision in the annotated model grant agreement on page 76. And there's a precise calculation of the SME owner unit cost.
Thanks. And the link to the annotated model grant agreement is already on our event webpage. So you can just click on that link and go to page 73, you said, I guess, and you will find it. Okay, next one. An employee starts his activity on 9th of March. I adapt the 1720 productive hours to the number of the months which he works. I calculate 1720 divided by 12 times 10 months. Is this correct?
So indeed, the 1720 corresponds to full-time employment over a year, and you calculate a pro rata if the person has not worked during the full year. As for the calculation, maybe you would have to go in more details, because it's not a full month. So you would have maybe to go down to the number of days for the part which is the rest of the month of March. But apart from that, indeed, it's the right way to do it with the pro rata.
Okay. Again, a question on what happens if a person changes status or salary or whatever during a reporting period. If a person with a consultant contract in compliance with 6.2 wins a public selection for employee on the project, how can we calculate the hourly rate in the reporting period? So I interpret this question in a way that the person first participated in the project as a consultant, and then during the reporting period, the person is hired by the beneficiary as an established employee. How will this situation be handled, Isabel?
David, I don't know if you have, because I
was thinking that if you could if it would be me, I would ask for the joker. because, we need a bit more details on under what category was declared before, because the consultant contract may have an impact on the calculation, in the sense that we might have to put both things together to calculate a single hourly rate, or we might have to calculate it separately. So to this question, and with the permission of Peter, we will ask for the joker and ask the inquiry to send it to the research inquiry service with more details about the first contract. The employment contract is clear, but something more about the first contract, if it was already declared, if it was already accepted, and the characteristics of that contract. And then with the details, we will be able to reply through the help desk.
Okay, so please, the person to ask this, put a bit more details to it and send it as a question to our research inquiry service that is available through the funding and tenders portal. And maybe Olivier, you can also put the direct link to the research inquiry service onto the webpage, onto the event webpage. Next question, can in-house consultants be based in a different African country, not in the beneficiary country? It is a bit, okay, you will reply, Isabel.
Yes, so if your consultant, you want to see if it fulfills the conditions for its cost to be declared under the category of personal cost for natural person with a direct contract with the beneficiary, one of the conditions is that the person works under similar conditions as an employee, and that means notably that it's submitted to the same presence requirements as employees. So if there is a possibility for employees, I don't know if there's a teleworking policy in the entity that is available for employees, and you apply the same thing for the consultant, that the condition may be fulfilled. You also have to ensure that the hours worked on the action can be recorded in a reliable manner. From the first impression on the question, it seems that it could be difficult to ensure that such a person based in a completely different country is subject to the same conditions as employees. But if it is the case, then it would possibly fall under the category of consultants under personal costs. However, if the consultant does not fulfill the conditions, the costs are not ineligible, then you may see if they are eligible under purchase of services, notably.
Okay, next question. Some of us are permanently employed and the employer cannot pay another salary from the project. We only provide time to the project in kind. How is this viewed? Not sure whether I fully understand, but Isabel or David, do you want to give it a try?
Well, the first thing I see is that if there is no salary, I read the employer cannot pay another salary from the project. To the extent that there is no salary paid, there is no actual costs, and our grants are reimbursing actual costs. So it seems to me difficult for that to fit in our declaration of personal costs.
Yeah, okay. Next one, how do we calculate the personnel costs for employees employed on an hourly basis and who do not work a full year or month? For instance, research assistants.
Isabel, if you want, I also looked for the explanation on this case in the annotated model grant agreement regarding the number of hours to be declared. Is no difference. Say the time records, the person encode the number of hours. So for the number of hours, it's exactly the same that any other employee. Now there might be a difference on the calculation of the hourly rate, and this is what I wanted to share with you. I'm gonna try again to take over the presentation, see if I can. Just give me 1 second because it has disappeared, unfortunately. No, sorry, it has been closed.
You should have access to it, David.
Yes. No, it's not your fault. It's my fault. I closed.
Okay,
I closed
sorry.
the document in. I closed the document in the annotated model grant. Oh, it should be here. Let me give a second try to it. Now, so there is a specific explanation also in the annotated model grant agreement, page 65, for the employment contract remunerated per hour, which you normally find the more convenient way in which you could calculate the hourly rate is by using the individual annual productive hours, because then, and under the conditions that are enumerated in this small section of the annotated model grant agreement, you would be able to use so to say the hourly rate that is fixed in the grant, in the contract of the person, to as the hourly rate also for the grant agreement. You see that there are a few conditions, so that the employment contract must fix the hourly rate to be paid. And that the employment contract must confirm that the salary of the person is the result of multiplying the hourly rate by the number of hours that the person work, not just in the project, but generally speaking, and that there are supporting documents, and that there are no other contracts with the same person, between the same person and the entity. And then under those conditions, eventually the result of this formula at the bottom of the explanations is that you will use the hourly rate fixed in the contract to multiply it by the number of hours worked in the project to calculate the eligible personal cost. So it's a specific case. We knew about it through contracts in UK. I don't know if this is the case of the Enquirer, but the explanations apply to any type of these contracts in which the person has not a fixed monthly salary, so to say, or weekly salary, but it depends on the number of hours that works for the company. Voila.
Okay. We have a few minutes left, so we go back to the remaining questions. Can we hire with a separate labor contract for a project an expert who works in different projects of the company with different contracts for each project? Again, tricky question. Who wants to start? Isabel?
Yeah, I'll just
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, an expert that works in a different projects of the company. It's not very clear to me if the expert is a part of the company or outside the beneficiary. In any case, if it's a labor contract, well, if it's an employment contract, it would fall into the category of employees. If it's a consultant, then with a contract for each project, you will have to fulfill the conditions that I've explained a few times now on the categories for consultants to fall under personal costs. Also, the fact that there is maybe a contract for each project may be a hint that this could fall into this specific case of project-based remuneration, where a person gets a different level of remuneration depending on the activity. And so maybe there it's a different type of remuneration for certain types of projects. And then if it's project-based remuneration, as I explained, you really have to look into details on the explanation in the annotated model grant agreement. But I don't see at first sight that there's an issue with that. It's just the way you have to determine with more details, more information, under which category that may fall.
Yes, indeed. A problem is it is not the difficulty there is to determine in which way you should calculate the hourly rate. Basically, to insist on what Isabel said, if we are speaking about employment contracts, you normally put all them together, but if the remuneration is different for some projects than from others, in some you pay more and in some other you pay less, then you most likely be, as Isabel said, in the project-based remuneration, and then you really need to pay a detailed attention to the explanations in the annotated grant agreement for project-based remuneration that we have not explained it today because unfortunately, that's a complex part of the calculations on personal costs. And if they are not employment contracts, if they fall under the category of purchase of services or subcontracting, well, in any case, there also be careful about how much you pay. You may imagine that we don't expect that you are paying more for the time that the person works, the consultant, for instance, works in the Horizon 2020 project than what you pay to the person in another similar national project or internal project. That would be tricky. So this perhaps, as it is, I don't think we can be more concrete or specific, but if the inquiry wants to get more details with further explanation, she or he can also contact us through the Research Inquiry Service.
Okay. Yet one more from consultant in compliance 6.2 to employee question. We intend a natural person claimed as personal cost who wins a public selection as an employee. Still, what is the meaning of natural person? I think here it's also better that you send a concrete case with a bit more explanation to the Research Inquiry Service. Or Isabel, David, can you give it another try?
No, preferably through the Research Inquiry Service.
Okay.
It's a very particular situation.
Yes.
It's not the first time that we see it, but on the one side, it strongly depends on these characteristics of the first contract, and on the other side, this is so specific that there is no explicit reference in the annotated model grant agreement. So on the basis of the details of the first contract, we will need to reply taking into account also previous consultations. So it's something that we better don't go on like that orally now, but through a written consultation.
Okay. Next one, can I have timesheets with more than 1,720 hours worked and only reclaim the 1,720 in the financial statements? How must I calculate the person months with hours worked or hours reclaimed? Isabel.
Yes. So the first part of the question, so indeed in the timesheet, you should put the real hours worked. So if it's more than 1,720, you should put all the hours worked on the action. Then there's the part when you are going to calculate your personal costs. And as we explained, you have to check at the end of this calculation the double ceiling. And if you used 1,720 for the calculation of the hourly rate, you can only claim hours up to 1,720. So indeed, you will reclaim only up to this number. And now the last part of the question about the person months. We have to clarify that person months is not a notion that is used for the calculation of personal costs. It's only used for reporting in terms of resources used on the action, and that's where we use this notion of personal cost. But there's no rules in the Horizon 2020 on how to calculate person months when you are reporting on the use of resources. So it's really depending on your practice of how to calculate person months that you will report on the effort and resources used in the technical report.
Okay. Next question is overtime cost part of the total personnel cost?
So again, it depends. It will be taken into consideration, and it depends on the option that you use for the annual productive hours. So if we're talking about that part of the formulas for the annual productive hours, if you use the fixed number, so the fixed number does not move, whatever overtime there is or not. If you use individual annual productive hours, you will add to the working to the productive hours the overtime. And if you use the standard annual productive hours, it depends on your standard annual accounting practices to calculate productive hours. That's for the part of the productive hours. As part of the personal costs, if it can be part of the personal costs recorded in your account, so we will take into consideration if that's an element of the remuneration to which the person is entitled under its contract, under the legislation, and it's not arbitrary. That's the main aspect. It should be based on objective conditions and be part of the usual practices of the beneficiary to have this cost part of the personal costs.
Okay. Next one. Is it possible to collect all questions and answers in a document? It would be very useful. I can reply to this one. We will not do this for two reasons. And the first reason is the main reason. Most of the replies that we have given here today can be found in existing guidance. So we don't want to repeat and to multiply the different sources of guidance, but refer you to the annotated model grant agreement in the first instance. And as David has already demonstrated, really most of the replies that we have given today can be found back in the annotated grant agreement. And we also have on the Funding Intenders portal the section on frequently asked questions with the convenient search function. And there you might also find guidance. So here the question is no, but with a reason. Okay, next one, just to be sure, no supporting documents are needed for the indirect costs, correct? I think I can reply yes, that's correct. And I think Soreen has already given some explanation earlier on that. Next question, we hire temporary or contract workers to work in the grant and report them under purchase of services. Are there cases where we can report them as personnel? Isabel.
So if you are hiring via a temporary work agency, this is indeed a case for a purchase of service or possibly for subcontract if this is covering the carrying out a whole action task. And there would not, if it's via a temporary work agency, there's no possibility to use personal costs because the consultants that are for which costs are eligible and personal costs are when there is a direct contract between the consultant and the beneficiary, and if there's a temporary work agency in the middle, so it's not a direct contract. I think that's addressing the question.
The next one, until when can we report our costs after the project ends, or should all costs be reported prior to the project ends? I think the question might have two meanings, and we will try to reply to both. So the one question is, when do the costs have to be actually incurred to be chargeable to the project? And the second question is, when do you have to send your final financial report? So these are the both sub-questions, Isabel.
Yes, so you report, you submit your reports after the end of the final reporting period within 60 days after the end of the reporting period. And in this final report, you can include costs incurred during the duration of the action, during this final reporting period, as well as during the 60 days after the end of the action. And for this period after the end of the action until the moment when you submit your report, you can the only costs which are eligible are those which are related to the preparation of the reports. You cannot anymore make research work and have eligible costs for this type of activity.
Okay, very clear. One more, for travel costs, if the estimated costs were mistakenly calculated for a particular beneficiary, could we declare the actual costs without informing the EC? Again, Isabel?
So I'm not really sure what's covered by this question, but what you have to declare is actual costs, so costs which you have actually incurred by the beneficiary. So I imagine if you paid a travel cost and accommodation for a meeting, you will have to declare what was actually paid. At the mistaken calculation at the level of the beneficiary, I don't know how it could enter into consideration, but what is important for us is that you report what you actually paid. And just for additional information at this point, the travel costs are eligible if they are in line with your usual practices for travel costs, and they must also comply with all the general eligibility conditions, such as being necessary for the action and being reasonable and in line with sound financial management and the other general eligibility conditions that you find in the Article 6.1a of the grant agreement. And these general conditions apply to all costs, so it's always useful to know about them.
Okay, my interpretation of the first part of the question is that in your proposal, you have made a cost estimation for the travel costs. And then when the project actually runs, you find out that a beneficiary has not properly estimated these costs in advance. And then the real costs for the travel are different. And indeed, it's possible, or you have to charge the real costs and not the ones you estimated at the beginning. And you don't have to explicitly inform the Commission on this. Okay, Olivier, thank you for making us again aware of the place where all the information on this event can be found. And I think we are now reaching the end of our planned seminar time. I thank you very, very much for the active contribution and the interesting questions. I, of course, also thank our speakers for the presentations and the reply to all the questions. Again, to tell you that this presentation, the whole video will be available for later viewing on YouTube or even on the event page itself. I would also encourage you, because we were not too many today, to exchange and distribute the information on the existence of this video to other colleagues in your country whom you might know are also involved in European projects, so that they can also benefit from the information that was exchanged here. So thank you very much again, and have a nice day. Bye-bye.